Hey, what's up, everybody? Welcome to another episode of the Orange and Black Insider Bengals podcast, brought to you in part by FOCO, the fans-only company. And go get your FOCO swag. We've talked about bobbleheads and all kinds of different stuff that they've got going, so go check that stuff out. I'm Anthony Cosenza. Finally, some rain has subsided on my end of the world, and so I've got natural light, fresh air coming into my little cave here, and happy about that, but happy to be joined as always by the man, the myth, the legend, the brains behind the operation, John Sheeran. John, what's new, my man?
Nothing much. It just hit me like the other day that I hadn't been outside in like 2 days because it was like 10 degrees. So fresh air is always nice, and to, let it go through your lungs a little bit. And I went outside a little bit today for some errands, but still freezing cold out here. But hoping to change that a little bit this weekend. I'll be out of town over by Anthony's side of the country, so I'm gonna escape this frozen wasteland for a little bit. But then it'll be back here on the grind with the combine, free agency, and all that. But we're right at the onset, I guess, of the calm before the storm, if you will, Anthony.
Yeah, and what's not cold are the takes on the Bengals heading into the offseason, and what and the Bengals aren't really being cold per reports on some activity or things they've got going supposedly behind the scenes. We'll talk about that with one of their star players. We'll talk about the recent news with the salary cap increase and what that may mean for the Bengals and the star players and outside free agency, all that stuff. And then my guy John has a fun draft profile at a position of need for sure for the Cincinnati Bengals coming up. So we'll talk about that in just a little bit. Want to remind folks that this podcast is part of the Believe in Cincy podcast channel, part of the National Believe Network, BLEAV. You got to go resubscribe to the audio side. If you like that, the audio side of things, you got to go to the Believe in Cincy podcast channel, where you can get our show, Talking Football with Bengal Jim and Friends, 3 and Out with Jason and Kevin, and of course, Matt and Willie No Ball with the coach Matt Minnick and Willie Letts, bringing you all kinds of different content. Hopefully you like what we're bringing you. Subscribe to that channel through your favorite audio streamer. Leave us a review if you can as well. If you like the video side of things, you can catch us on one of 3 Twitter accounts that we're streaming to, or Cincy Jungle's Facebook page, and of course, as always, on our YouTube channel. Our YouTube channel has our stuff as well as the 3 and Out broadcast as well. So check that out, and you can subscribe to that. On the bottom right, and if you're watching on YouTube, you can subscribe to that. There's a show icon underneath John there. Click that, do the subscribe thing, the thumbs up, all the things. We appreciate that. And we are going to kick things off, John. Our friend, James Rapine over at Sports Illustrated, broke some news that started to gain a lot of national traction earlier this week. We did a little YouTube short video talking a little bit about it, but and by the way, I thought it was pretty clever that we put I don't know if you like the old band 311, but they have a song called "I'll Be Here a While," so we intentionally put that to the YouTube short if you didn't catch that. But supposedly, John, and it's a very credible source in, of course, our buddy James Rapine over at Sports Illustrated, but this has started to gain traction that the Bengals are reportedly planning to use the franchise tag again. I believe it's the non-exclusive one on Tee Higgins, and this just a smart business move for the Bengals as they get set to try and work things out with a number of stars, 3 at least to be exact, this offseason in terms of extensions, new contracts, etc. But Higgins now, the Bengals are obviously going to try and they've got some time to officially place the tag if they need to, but at least this is going to be something that's in place to protect themselves and potentially work out a long-term deal with Higgins.
Yeah. So, and James is one of the more connected
For
official
sure.
members
For sure.
of for the Bengals. So he's well connected, and I think his report, it was along the lines of Higgins's camp expects the tag to be used at some point, and there's an argument to be made that the Bengals could use it sooner rather than later, just to get it out of the way, just to be like, hey T, we don't want you hitting free agency, we want you here. Let's utilize this. So the window to exclusively negotiate you is basically extended until July. Let's figure something out. There's that argument to be made. There's also the argument that Higgins's camp, expects it to be used at some point, which means the Bengals could still use these next, I believe, as of this recording, 13 days to work out a long-term contract before they would have to use it on March 4th, which is the Tuesday after the combine. It was reported by both Tom Pelissero of NFL Media and Jeremy Fowler of ESPN that it could be that situation where they try to work out a deal before having to use the tag, and they may use the tag on that deadline. And that is more along the lines of what other teams in recent years have done, or what teams traditionally do with the franchise tag. Remember, T was tagged last year. He's one of 8 players that were tagged. He was the only one who didn't receive some type of extension. 2 of them got tagged and traded to new teams and then got new contracts. Brian Burns of the Carolina Panthers went to the Giants. L'Jarius Sneed from the Chiefs went to the Titans. Both of them got the deals that they wanted. Everyone else got extensions with their original team. T was the only one who had to watch all that from the sidelines, and he wasn't very happy about it. That's why he had 2 trade requests with that. So that is what typically happens when teams use the tag. They kind of wait until they have to do it, and then an extension will come around, either right in the week leading up to free agency or during free agency, but it doesn't take that long for a new deal to kind of come up. So I took it as Higgins's camp expects negotiations to continue or pick back up at this time, run through the deadline, and then if a deal isn't done by then the tag would be used. But at this point, Anthony, like, there's a clear framework, I think, or a clear idea, ballpark of what T is expected to get paid, what the Bengals probably want to pay him, and that's how these negotiations are going to turn out. The Bengals are going to have a number. T's camp is going to have a number. It's all about working towards that compromise. And the tag, like you said, is just a vehicle to make sure that no other team gets to bid for him. And the non-exclusive part of this is I think teams can like offer 2 first-round picks or something of that nature in order to just get him, which, you know, the Bengals may consider at that point, but that's still a pretty steep price, and it would probably only be used in like a last case ditch effort scenario if the Bengals don't think that this is going to happen. But the reason why they're using the tag now is not because they're far apart in reaching a contract, but this is just how other teams use the tag. It's just a vehicle to make sure that enough time is had in order for an extension to get done. And the Bengals believe that an extension can get done with T this time around.
It's a protective measure for the Bengals side of things. And then, of course, T, to his credit, I mean, we're thinking this is the case when he moved away reportedly from David Mulugeta and with Jamar Chase's representation. And we all know that Jamar Chase's representation is also working on hammering out a big mega extension for him as well. But you kind of read between the lines and you say, well, maybe T's trying to get something that let's extend that bridge of negotiation a little bit on our side that maybe wasn't there or was perceived to not be there last year. My understanding of the non-exclusive tag, as you kind of alluded to, it's a little bit kind of an offer sheet type of situation, right? Where he can go out if the Bengals do not get a long-term deal in place and things aren't there by the time free agency opens, he can negotiate, Ken Higgins, with other teams. They can propose a deal, and Higgins's camp can then say, okay, this is the deal we've been proposed by X team. Bengals, are you going to match this or not? The Bengals have the opportunity to match, and if they do not, then that team that has offered Higgins on the open market said deal would then have to give the Bengals 2 first-round picks in compensation. So by and large, I mean, not that Higgins is an extremely valuable player, because he is, but by and large, you would think that a team, like you said, giving up 2 first-round picks for this player plus a big contract to him, that would be a hefty pill for another team to swallow. Thus, I mean, I don't want to stick my foot in my mouth a few weeks from now, but thus the expectation is that Higgins will be a Bengal for at least 2025. They will work on a deal, or if things just completely fall apart, you have a tag and trade situation. Or if there is that team that is out there that is willing to pay not only a hefty financial price, but a hefty draft pick price, then all of that then can go to the Bengals. So all in all, just an obvious move, but a pretty savvy one by the Bengals to keep their stars in place. And here we go, John. I mean, it's been the Bengals aren't going to step up. They're not going to do the right things. They're not going to pay the players. They're not going to do it. And lo and behold, this is kind of the first big step in the process of saying, we want this guy here.
Yeah, and it looks like the optics, I understand it from a certain degree where like this guy has been here for 5 years. You've technically been the negotiating window has been alive for 2 years, even though they didn't really negotiate last year, which is why the tag was placed on him in the first place, right? The context of each of these tags, and again, this tag isn't even official yet. The context definitely matters because last year at this time they were so far apart, and they knew that they wanted T to play in 2024. They knew that he had no choice but to do that, which is why they placed the tag on him. And again, that's not typically how teams use the tag, and it's not typically how things go about it. It's typically just, hey, like we want to extend you, and we don't want to compete with other teams for extending you and signing you, because if he does get to the open market, he would probably make more than the Bengals would be willing to offer, and that's not unique to T in this case. Like that would be the case with other free agents that have been tagged in years past, right? So that's why teams use the tag. It's why players don't really like the tag, because it definitely favors the team in that sense. But no, the reason why the Bengals are doing this is because they believe that they can get something done if they have the exclusive opportunity to negotiate with him. And the $26 million, I think $26.2 million is the price for the second tag that was locked in last year when they tagged him the first time, because the second tag is 120% more than the first tag. So that is a good starting point for these negotiations, and say, hey, you can play on this 1 year, $26 million salary, or you can take a deal that's a little bit more than that on an average annual value basis. And that's where the Bengals leverage in this case comes into play. And that's what any team would do. Like you said, it's savvy, but it is still at the end of the day pretty standard. And I think the most important thing here is, obviously the Bengals don't want to mess this up. Like they wouldn't obviously let him enter free agency. No one would let the top free agent in the NFL just leave just like that. They would at least try to trade him, and in that sense, or a tag and trade as the worst case scenario. So it's not like the Bengals are doing anything special here. But I also do think there's a sense of they wouldn't tag him again if they didn't think that there was a legitimate chance that they could get a deal done, which is different than what we talked about, before December, when this whole narrative started about him changing his agent and how all this positive momentum began. I don't think that they would want to have him on the tag for a second year in a row, for him to go through all of that again. And, maybe they don't care that much. Like, obviously, at the end of the day, it's still a business and everything. But I do think that with the way that he handled things last year and how he kind of just put it all beside and focused on the season and had as good of a season as you could have expected anyone to have for only playing 12 games, I think that they don't want to go through that again. And I definitely know that T doesn't want to go through that again. So I think using the tag this time is not of just like, hey, you did this before, you can do it again, but like let's get this done and let's avoid all that controversy. So like let's just do what other teams do in this case.
Yeah, just to recap too, and we've talked about how we've talked about the history here, right? So Tee Higgins and Joe Burrow worked out together with Jordan Palmer out here in my neck of the woods back before they were even official teammates. And obviously they built some friendship and rapport there. Burrow, I think just kind of reading between the lines, you can kind of say, well, from that workout, Burrow probably said, hey, if we need another receiver, this is probably the short list. Higgins was obviously the choice, top pick in the second round, thus capping a really good first couple of picks in that class. So from there, they've built the rapport. Higgins has been very productive on this team and is a weapon that not many teams have, that he can stretch the field a bit. He doesn't have huge long speed, but he can stretch the field a bit. He's got an insane catch radius. He makes the tough catches, and thus being a very valuable guy. And so then on Radio Row, as we've recapped as well, Burrow kind of said that this is one of the guys that they've talked internally about keeping, and they want to keep their stars, etc. And so now here we are here with this news, and I think there's a misconception about, first it was the Bengals aren't going to pay him. Tee Higgins is going to leave, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Now it's, well, they, of course they did the franchise tag. It's just, there's always some sort of negative spin nationally, it seems, with the team and all of this, but it's the right move. I do think that this again shows from both sides, kind of as you alluded to, that bridge was not burned. And if anything, it's been extended for negotiations, a long-term contract. And we'll get to the salary cap in a little bit because that plays into this. But again, it's just a smart move. It's the right move. And hopefully the Bengals continue to work on this. Higgins camp continues to work on this along with other deals to the other stars that they want to get done.
Yeah. Again, I understand that on the surface, it looks crazy for the Bengals to pay both Higgins and Chase until you look at the context of the roster and the fact that they have no one really else to pay other than Trey Hendrickson. So I get it. It's not something that other teams normally do, which is why I think from a national perspective, there was an expectation that T reaches the market. But even still, like top receivers who get paid what Higgins would make on the open market, they don't just leave like that. They would get traded like an AJ Brown situation, and then they would get a new deal from a new team, or they would just get signed by the original team, because it's become to the point where receiver is the second most valuable in terms of monetary value. It's become the second most valuable position in the NFL in terms of the contracts that are given out. And teams just don't let those guys walk. The Bengals, for as stingy as they are in their way of doing business, when they recognize that they have a real asset on their hands, they're not just going to let them go for nothing, right? Like that it's a different situation compared to a Jesse Bates or a Kevin Zeitler in that sense, when the money is at wherever it is now. And that is, I think, the context that has been missing from a national perspective. And Robert Oberek in the comment section was asking about, like, why didn't they sign him like right after the Super Bowl? I think that's the other thing to look at here as well, because yes, like they could have signed T from the minute that the regular season ended. Like after the season ends, like they want to focus on the future and contracts and all that jazz. But I think there is also a sense where T's camp wouldn't want to accept a deal immediately, because he is one of the top free agents or impending free agents on the market. And if he were to take a deal that would be slightly less than what he could get in the open market before there's even a possibility that he reaches it, I think that would look bad it would look bad to the rest of the players of that caliber, and it would set a bad precedent, and then other teams would kind of use it as leverage against those types of players. So I think there's a sense from both sides that the timing of when this deal gets done matters, so that neither side looks particularly weak. And especially with T's agent, who's also Jamar's agent, like there's a sense that they want to make sure that they don't look weak in this scenario, and they want to make sure that even if he does take a slightly quote unquote team friendly deal, it's not without putting up a fight, at least for lack of a better term.
Yeah, so I think the franchise tag last year was a touch under 22 million, and this year, as you mentioned, was north of 26 million. So there is an increase there. The one thing before we move on to the salary cap news, you and I have been around this team and we've covered them, followed them for a very long time. We know that the Bengals, by and large, are a reactionary franchise, right? They tend to react instead of be proactive, whether that is in free agency, the draft, et cetera. So I think this is what I'm going to find intriguing, because you bring up a really, really good point that from a PR perspective, from both sides, getting a deal done before free agency, a long-term deal with Tee Higgins would create a lot of waves, positive waves. But a distinct possibility, John, with this non-exclusive tag does exist if the Bengals revert back to being a reactionary team, that he goes out and he gets a deal from somebody or a proposal, and that's the framework that then he would use, just to be like, if the Bengals are proposing in the next couple of weeks a long-term deal that maybe he feels isn't quite what he can get on the open, or could have gotten on the open market, another team could propose a big deal, and then that's where the Bengals would say, okay, well, now that's where we're working instead of over here. So I do want to exercise a little bit of caution. I don't want to say pessimism, but there's a possibility that scenario happens where the deal doesn't get done. He goes out and gets an offer sheet of some sort, brings it back to the Bengals, and then that's now the negotiating arena.
Right. And as we've seen in years past, the Bengals draw a pretty distinct line in the sand with these things. Rarely do they cross over it, even for their best players when it gets to that point. But I think at this point, the Bengals are going to try to make sure it doesn't get to that point. And if it does, then we can start the montages for the goodbyes for Tee Higgins. But until then, he's a Bengal, which is funny, Anthony, because I feel like we've been talking about Tee Higgins, the free agent, for 3 years now, and it still hasn't happened. So that economy's still rolling on, I guess.
Yep. And Mark Young says, are we assuming non-exclusive? That I believe the report was, most of the reports are saying that it was a non-exclusive that was going to be used on this side of things. And then Jason Von Stein, our buddy, I love you, man. I don't know that I truly agree with this. T has a history of being hurt. Yeah, he does. But he also has a history of being productive. Joe can win without him. We need Chase, and Trey, meaning Trey Hendrickson, is special. There's a lot of truth to that, but I do think that T is a major, major piece of the puzzle. You and I have talked about this a lot on the show. He just brings a dimension to the offense that is missed when he is not out there. So you just got to kind of take the hit of, he's going to miss 2 games, 4 games, a year. That's kind of who he has been, but he's also been hovering right around for the most part, except for 2023, 60-ish catches, close to 1,000 yards, and 7-ish touchdowns. I mean, that's who Tee Higgins has been as a quote unquote number 2 on this team.
It was my cousin texted me like a couple weeks ago because he saw a stat that he couldn't believe, and it was the fact that 80% of Tee Higgins's catches in his career have gone for first downs. And he's like, "There's no way this is true, right?" And I'm like, not only is it true, it's more than that because you're not even including postseason stats. It is kind of crazy that when you look at it, even with Jake Browning as his quarterback, I think 14 of his 15 receptions with Browning moved the chains. So it's like whenever the ball's in his hands, something good is happening. He may not be Jamar Chase in that facet, but it is really astounding when you look at the numbers and what his value is when he's on the field.
Great point. Drive extender and red zone weapon for sure. For sure. So that being said, a report came out just today, I believe, that the proposed or projected NFL salary cap for this coming year is somewhere going to be between 277.5 and 281.5 million. I believe the jump, if I read correctly, from just 2 years ago, it's jumped like 53 million from just 2 years ago. So that is a gigantic jump, and that is not only indicative of just pay raises, et cetera, but also that the league is wanting parity. They want teams to spend money. You put out a tweet too about a quote unquote salary floor as well, which I thought was a very astute one. So you can kind of talk about that too. But this now continues to increase the possibility that the Bengals not only extend their stars, keep their stars that we've talked about, Jamar Chase, Trey Hendrickson, Tee Higgins, but also that they can do maybe a little bit more in outside free agency, especially if they shed some of the albatross contracts from last year's outside free agent class. For the most part, they can work some things. And as we mentioned, this is now especially critical in a year. The Bengals usually have at least 7, if not upwards of 9 or 10 draft picks in a class. And this year they have set to be 6, I believe. So it's less than usual. And so that's where this higher number now is going to play into outside free agency for the Bengals and inside free agency. But also, are they going to finally squash the national media? Who was it? Harry Douglas, Cheapinati or something is what he called him on a Stephen A. Smith show. But this is just big news, not only for the league, but big news for the Bengals, especially with impending contracts that they need to get done. That'll be high value.
For starters, we can do a little better than Cheap and Natty. Like I feel like he just kind of used that off the cuff. Like we can workshop that. We can figure something out with that. But let's talk about the salary cap and what it means to the Bengals, because the actual salary cap number matters, but in terms of the Bengals space, it doesn't, because it doesn't matter what the salary cap is. The Bengals are always going to have, and we both know this, man. It's always going to be about 8 to 10 million space every single year. It could be 500 million, and the Bengals will spend up to like 490 in cap dollars for that season. They're never going to be right up next to it. They're never going to have a ton of space by the end. It's always pretty much the same. What really matters here is the cap ceiling, which is going to be, let's say 280, right? Between 277 and 281. The unadjusted cap ceiling matters because when you look at how much cash the Bengals spend in a given year, it's always about 8% more than what the unadjusted cap floor is. And Jake Lisco of Locked On Bengals, another decent Bengals podcast, did a great job of explaining this over social media. He went back to 2020 when the Bengals first really started being active in free agency, and you can see a very clear trend. It's just around a little bit more than what the unadjusted cap is. And the Bengals cap is always a little bit higher because they have rollover every single year. But essentially what that means is if the cap is 280, then you could expect the Bengals to spend 300 million in actual cash. And people are like, well, why the Bengals could just sit on the cash, right? Like they could, but they don't historically. And they can't because, like what you said, there is every 4 years, NFL teams are required to spend at least 89% of the salary cap through that 4-year period. They are required to spend a good chunk of money every single year. And 300 million sounds like a lot. It's still not even that much compared to what other teams spend on a yearly basis. Like the Eagles and Browns are way up there because that's just what they do. And the Bengals would never be quite there. But the Bengals, you can expect them to spend this year, not in salary cap dollars, but in actual cash, the stuff that players actually get, 300 million. They're on the books for about 211 million right now, and that's including with Alex Kappa, Sheldon Rankin, Zach Moss, Jermaine Pratt, and Sam Hubbard on the books. If you take those contracts off the books, that's well over $100 million that the Bengals are going to spend. That's more than enough to spend on Trey Hendrickson, Jamar Chase extensions, re-signing Tee Higgins, on top of free agents. Anything about the Bengals can't afford all three of these guys and building free agency, it's a lie based off of just people's brains kind of stuck in the narrative, but also ignoring the actual math here that goes into how the Bengals calculate this on a yearly basis. So the salary cap jump is big, not just for the space, but it tells us how much the Bengals are actually going to spend. And it's going to be a lot this year.
It's going to be a lot. The kind of tying in last segment's topic and this one, gone are a bit of the days of the Bengals not being, they hadn't used the franchise tag all that often. And when they did, it was on like kickers. Remember Shane Graham got it. I think Mike Nugent got it one year. Stacey Andrews got it, and he was kind of a fringe starter. So it's now they are using it for their stars, and this plays into this salary cap number and the cash number that you mentioned too. So the Bengals have a lot of space to work with, and I think there still exists a lot of cynicism, and probably rightfully so, nationally and within the fan base. We're seeing some comments from people, they're not going to pay and they can't keep all three and, all that kind of stuff. They can. It's will they? And I think there still just exists the cynicism from whenever the 90s, who Mike Brown was, maybe even still is, letting valuable players walk out of the door. Our buddy Jason again said, talking about screwing up the Sanu Jones Jr. and then subsequently Andrew Whitworth situation in free agency, where they got a little overconfident and likely were a little bit frugal in those scenarios where they thought they could just replicate all of that, and that just did not happen. And I think the hope is that they've learned those lessons the hard way from letting valuable guys internally go. And now they've got 3-star players. The guys we're talking about are your quarterback is top 2 or 3. Your defensive end is probably a top 5 overall defensive player in the league. Chase, top 5 probably offensive player in the league. And then Higgins, he's one of the top receivers in the league as well. So the other facet of this, John, is, again, you brought up Jesse Bates and that sort of thing a couple minutes ago. We've talked about this, like you said, probably for 2 or 3 years now. There are positions the Bengals pay, and one of them is wide receiver. They pay wide receivers, and they pay them well. So that's where all of this also comes into play, where you can talk about them being cheap, whether you're the national media or an old-time cynical Bengals fan, all you want. But there are a lot of examples where they have paid multiple players at positions they value, and multiple players simultaneously at those positions. And I go back to the early mid Marvin Lewis era, not talking about the Jones Sanu, but talking about the Chad Hushmanzada, Rudy Johnson, Willie Anderson type of Carson Palmer. All of those kind of avalanched on them, and they needed to do it to keep those guys together. So they've done it in the past. It just hasn't been, I think, as regularly or as frequently as other teams who have won championships of late, right? So again, going back to last segment, maybe that step, albeit one that just seems to be an elementary level business decision on Higgins and reportedly using the tag again this year. Maybe this is again kind of a slow march to change once again for the Bengals. We'll see what happens over the next few weeks, though.
Yeah, I mean, to be clear, they haven't earned the benefit of the doubt necessarily for doing
No.
things beyond expectation, and that needs to be very clear. What we're saying isn't beyond expectation. It's just based off of what they've always done. And the difference is now the numbers of the contracts have ballooned, but it's all relative to how much money the team actually has. This team is not cash poor. This team has gotten at least $400 million in actual money from the league revenue. This is based off of last year's numbers. That number is numbers increased, right? It's you have a maximum of $280 million to spend on the cap this year on your roster, but you can spend more than that in terms of cash. There's other sources of revenue that the Bengals are now getting through other sponsorships and partnerships that they have all over the stadium and the practice facility and everything like that. There's money to be spent here. It's never been about a lack of cash. It's been about them not valuing their players properly, which was the problem with Jesse Bates. They lowballed him. That was the problem with Andrew Woodworth. They lowballed him. They didn't even offer Kevin Zeidler a contract, which is criminal looking back 10 years ago. They lowballed Tee Higgins initially a couple years ago. They're paying the price for that. They appropriately valued Jamar Chase last year. They just disagreed on when the cash would hit in that contract. So all these things happened. It's true. They've had issues with valuing their own players despite their desire to bring them back. The question now is, look at the roster. Who are you paying? Who? Because the best free agent in the entire NFL is Tee Higgins. If Trey Hendrickson was a free agent, he would be the second best free agent. If Jamar Chase was a free agent, he would be the best free agent. Who are you paying if not those guys? How are you going to get to $300 million? The assumption that they won't pay these guys is making that you're going to spend a ton of money on bad players or just not spend as much money at all for what? For what reason? Like it doesn't add up. It's not impossible that the Bengals mess this up and that only maybe one of these guys get paid, but money's going to get spent. Money is going to get spent, and it could be on bad players, right? It could be that disaster scenario, but the assertion that they can't afford it and they don't have the money is not true. Let's get that out of the way.
Yeah, and Daryl, I don't know if you had a copy and paste problem here, but talking about Jonathan Joseph, Eric Steinbach, and Mike Goff. Jonathan Joseph, yes, that is a position they like to pay in cornerback, but the two others, John, what position did they play for the Bengals? And you mentioned another one, guard. Guard is not a traditional position that they have valued, and so that's why they allowed. And again, some of those were way in the past too, but Steinbach, they paid Willie Anderson and Levi Jones and thought that was going to be okay to let Steinbach walk. That still was okay in some regards because those tackles were two bookend tackles for the Bengals for a long time. Mike Goff is going back even further than that, and I think that's what, if I'm not mistaken, I got to look up the timeline there, but that's probably, I think, what prompted them to draft Eric Steinbach with the first pick in the second round. So, I mean, there are instances and outliers where you can name certain things, but we are talking about basically in terms of their core star guys. They've paid one in their quarterback. That's a position they always value. Two wide receivers. They value those guys pretty heavily. And of course, an edge defender who is one of the most dominant players in the league. Edge players, they pay better. The Bengals usually prioritize that over others. But I think to your point, in terms of spending, in terms of cash that they'll have, shedding some contracts off of the books and creating more space, more cash, etc. I just hope we are looking, because remember how fun, and maybe it was just because they hadn't been overly active in outside free agency prior to that, but remember how fun the 2021 and 2020 also, those two free agency periods were for the Bengals. I mean, they were getting a lot of good players that seemingly worked out, and you go, oh, wow, that's a good move there. Good move there. I hope we're going to have that and then some with the internal signings by the Bengals this spring. And like you said, the wherewithal is there, right? I mean, it's there. And as the Bengals players did on Radio Row, they placed the ball in the team's court, and it's up to them to pick it up and run with it and get things done.
100%. That year always stands out because of how smart they were with their money. They made quality signings that didn't break the bank, and they filled out the roster very nicely. And that was just evaluating guys properly and just building the roster in a very smart way. Money is always spent with this team. It's just a matter of how they spend it. And they've had issues. They've had massive issues with spending it the wrong ways. And Bobby Hart comes to mind, right? Preston Brown comes to mind, right? Like these things happen. Like if they don't spend it on good players, they will spend it on bad players. And if they don't make these decisions with these guys that they clearly want to spend and they clearly now do value at an appropriate level to pay them properly, the money's going to get spent otherwise. That if you have a fear about this offseason and you're a Bengals fan, it's about how they spend this money, not if.
Yep. Good point. Salary cap projected at $277.5 million, and in between that and $281.5 million. Again, now if the Bengals do exercise that tag once again on Tee Higgins, you're looking at the $26-27 million range on that franchise tag. Of course, as we mentioned, they're trying to get a long-term deal done, and then you've got others in play there too. So big news. I mean, big news for the league, big news for the Bengals as they look to retool their roster going forward, and hopefully they make the right moves internally and externally to do so. This is the Orange and Black Insider Bengals podcast, brought to you in part by FOCO, the fans-only company. Go check out all the cool products that they've got, bobbleheads and very unique limited edition products that you can't really find on other large NFL sites, and it is fully licensed stuff. So go check that out and tell them we sent you, or the Believe in Cincy channel sent you, and you can get 10% off of your orders and all kinds of different stuff. So go check out foco.com and look up the Bengals side of things there. They've got some cool stuff. I've got some stuff from there before our partnership, and it's pretty cool stuff. John, you have a draft profile for us, and if I'm the resident, West Coast guy, the guy who loves the former Pac-12 and now Big 12 guys, that sort of thing. You have an affinity for a certain region and a certain school as well you should. It is your alma mater. So you have a player that you want to share with us, that local guy, but also a big position in need for the Bengals coming into this offseason.
There may not be a more local guy in this here draft class. Is Luke Kandra, guard out of Elder High School in the west side of Cincinnati. Went to play college at Louisville to start, and Louisville's head coach at the time was Scott Satterfield. Scott Satterfield became the head coach at the University of Cincinnati, and the best thing that he's done in these 2 years, aside from the best thing that he's done was bring Luke Kandra to UC as a transfer player from Louisville, because 3-star recruit out of high school, one of the best players in the city, had offers from Boston College and Indiana, went to Louisville, played about half a year in his second year, but transferred to UC to be a starter, and it's worked out tremendously, because I think in this draft class, there's not a better combination of run blocking prowess with stability and pass protection. And he's not going to be drafted in the early rounds. He's not going to be like a top 75 or 100 pick because of some things. But Anthony, I think if you look at the tape, there's not a lot of more cleaner players at this position than Luke Kandra. This is just about a minute of some plays, all at right guard. But the things that stand out with him: phenomenal foot speed, the ability to get out into space to make second level blocks, and the grip strength he has.
Nice.
Right?
Yeah.
Excuse me. He locks onto guys, and once he has you in his grasp, there is no letting go. You are stuck there. And that, combined with, I think, the core strength he has. Yeah, like it's a lot of fun watching him not just go up into the second level, but just displace guys in a phone booth. And it's very telling when it also looks very easy, and how he moves and how he displaces guys. It's very simple. It doesn't look like he's exerting too much force in the process, because there's that natural athleticism. There's that natural power to his game. And the one maybe minor drawback with him is that he's got short arms. He's got 32.5-inch arms. He doesn't have a long wingspan. And I think teams may knock him for that. It may be why he falls into like the middle of the draft, in the middle of the pack, and maybe gets lost in the shuffle. But how do you compensate for that? How do you overcome that? And I think when he times his punches correctly, and
sorry, go ahead. Can you rewind that one again real quick? I don't want to interrupt you. There was one a couple of plays ago where he does the nice pass off the defender and then goes and finds, I think it was maybe, this one right here. No, same team. If you can go back to that maybe, but there was also one in the Senior Bowl where you see him pass it off. See how, yeah. I mean, that's beautiful. And then there's one coming up here in the Senior Bowl too, but that's beautiful stuff right there. And that's stuff that has plagued the Bengals, being able to pass off defenders correctly and pick up another. But I didn't mean to interrupt you, man. You were talking about hand placement and punch. Go ahead.
No, yeah, like I was almost losing my voice there, so thank you for the pause. No, like I think again, it's so much of evaluation is looking at what guys may not have, right? And I don't think he has necessarily the ideal size and measurables that teams would look at. Oh, he's a ball of clay that I can mold him into myself. But how does he overcome that? And I think with his quickness out of his stance, the way that he can create space in pass protection, and he can get out into space, both in zone and gap scheme blocking, that is a good way for him to maximize the length that he does have with his arms, and how and his placement with where his hands are when he locks onto you. I think all of that is very sound and solid, and he's obviously been extremely well coached in his 5 years in college. He only played 4, but he was in there for 5 years. I think all of that adds up to someone who you can plop in day one in a competition to be a starter, and I think he would still impress any coach that he would go to. And I think for the Bengals, you're talking about a team that's probably not going to draft a guard in the first couple of rounds. I think with the prioritization of defense, maybe if they really fall in love with someone, maybe that's the case. But I mean, traditionally, like you're talking about a team that looks at the middle rounds for this position. Someone who not only has the starting experience at right guard, has played a little bit of left guard as well, but is scheme versatile. Again, I think reach blocks aren't a problem. Pulling out space isn't a problem. Extremely strong hands. I think can just win in the phone booth, what you need in the AFC North. All of that in a 4th round pick, and a guy who grew up in Cincinnati, who went to UC, who lived here his whole life, aside from 2 years at Louisville. I just think that if you want to talk about just pure fits for the Bengals in this draft, the stars are aligning, I think, for them to take a chance on a guy like Kandra and to have him compete for a starting job, because one of the jobs is going to go to a free agent. I think we can all agree at this point that's probably the route that they're going to go. But I don't think they're going to sign 2 guys in free agency. I think it's going to come down to a rookie competing with maybe Volson or maybe Cody Ford or maybe a low-level free agent, right? But I think if you give Kandra a fair shot in that battle, I think there's a really good chance that he could win it, because I don't think there's a lot of things that he can't do.
So, any chance, because you know what the Bengals like out of offensive linemen, and this may or may not change with the coaching change here, but the old versatility gene, could he play both guard spots if needed? You mentioned right guard, and I think that's pretty much primarily where he's been. Is there an opportunity that he could play either guard spot in a pinch? Probably not center unless there was an absolute emergency situation there that's needed. But do you see that being a possibility that also would maybe intrigue the Bengals?
Yeah, I think if you're Luke Kandra, you have to be ready to play either left or right guard. He played right guard mostly in college. I want to say he was a left guard in high school, but I have to double check that. He may have even repped at center just a couple of times, just in a pinch. But he wasn't at the Senior Bowl. He was at the Hula Bowl, which is a much lesser known college all-star game in Florida. Like even before the Shrine and the Senior Bowl, I thought it was ridiculous that he was snubbed from either of the more well-known all-star games, but he wasn't the snub at the Combine, which I think is going to be really big for him. Not only to verify how long his arms are, and if that's a deal breaker for some teams, could potentially the Bengals. We don't know, particularly Scott Peters is the new offensive line coach's preference for that in that particular measurement, but I think it's gonna be big to see what that arm length is confirmed, and specifically his short area quickness. Like that's so indicative of future success for interior offensive linemen, no matter what position that you are. But yeah, like he's going to have to talk about, playing either side of the center. And if you're the Bengals, at this point, you don't know which guard spot is going to be that competition. You could sign a veteran left guard or a right guard, right? So I think, yeah, the safe plays for Kandra to probably play right guard, but if you had to have him play left guard, I think he could do it as well.
That you talk about, some of the detriments that would cause him to potentially fall to early to maybe mid day 4. I mean, there was a guy that a lot of us really liked coming into last year's class. The Bengals thankfully ended up getting him in Matt Lee, who is a 7th round pick, projected to probably go earlier than that, but size, etc., were kind of an issue or a perceived issue. But not only in preseason, but he was kind of extra offensive lineman at times in the Bengals lineups this year, and he's a guy that probably, I mean, maybe not this year, but probably maybe a year or two down the road, looks like a capable NFL starter at center. And this sounds not that he's necessarily a project, Kandra, but it sounds like this is a guy, whether he is going to come in and compete right away for a spot, but a year or two down the line could be a very nice starter for a team. Maybe not Pro Bowl, etc., but probably a guy that's a steady presence. And by the way, that is all the Bengals need. I mean, I would love to have them have a stud Pro Bowl guy and multiple of them on their offensive line, but they need steadiness. They don't need these wild pendulum swings of productivity or lack thereof.
Yeah, and it would just be nice, I think, for once to just have a Clint Bowling situation develop. Like, Clint Bowling was a 4th round pick in that now legendary 2011 draft class for when they drafted AJ and Andy in the first 2 rounds. But Clint Bowling was a 4th round pick who became a starter in year 2 and just held down left guard for like 7-8 years following that. And he was never of concern. He was never necessarily a great player. He wasn't like an Andrew Weaver type player, but he was just solid. He could just get the job done, and he would rarely make mistakes. And that's kind of along the lines of what I see Kandra being. Like, not the same exact type of body type, but I also think it was interesting how in over 2,000 snaps at both UC and Louisville, only 2 career penalties. Like, his hands were never in precarious spots. He was very rarely called for holding, for false start, or hands to the face, or anything along those lines. Like, his tape is amongst the cleanest that I've seen so far in this draft class. At really any position, he just gets the job done, no matter what the competition is. So those players exist outside of the first few rounds. The Bengals don't have to draft offensive linemen all the time with premium picks. Like, the goal should be to find players like Kandra to exercise some value here, so that you can spend other premium positions on spend other premium picks, on other positions that need that type of talent. So I think players like Kandra are what the Bengals need to identify in order to build this roster out in a smart way.
So I'm gonna extrapolate a little bit on this. Just by the way, on the UC website, he is listed at 6'4", 323. So that's a big dude, right? I mean, that's a stout dude. But there are many, many things here. If you want to go back to, especially the early Zach Taylor era and the traits they look for, especially in some of these rookies. And there's a lot of boxes checked here, not only for on-field play, but otherwise. On field, you're talking about, a guy who's an established starter. He was a Sports Illustrated this last year, 2024 alone. Sports Illustrated second team All-American, College Football Network second team All-American, All Big 12 first team, All Big 12 2023 All Big 12 first team from the Associated Press, All Big 12 second team from the coaches in 2023. Walter Camp All-America second team in 2023. And then here you go also, John, just from the other intangible / leadership / smarts, all that stuff that I think Zach Taylor really hones in on. 2024 CSC Academic All-District, right? And then you look at, aside from all those other accolades, a guy who graduated with his MBA and, maybe I'm grasping at straws here, but it's noted in his bio that he got married at his time in at UC, maybe pointing to a maturity, a maturity standpoint that, again, that creates that solid locker room culture. I'm not saying marriage one way or the other, but I mean, you got to be a pretty mature kid if you're in college getting married, I would think. So maybe these are some of the things, aside from the on-field stuff, the on-field accolades awards that Zach Taylor and company look at, saying, this is a guy we got to have in this locker room.
Yeah, team captain as well. So I think just another bullet point for the leadership. And I think
Yep.
just being from Cincinnati, living in Cincinnati, that probably helped out. Kind of formulating a marriage there in the middle of college. But I think Mr. Whisper had a really good question here in
Yep.
the YouTube chat. Like we know Frank Pollock liked his quote unquote glass eaters, but what kind of players do you think Scott Peters is looking for? More athleticism comes to mind for me. Based off of what I've kind of heard from him, I do think that he does value measurables. He it was very quick to point out the rare arm length and just overall size that both Orlando Brown Jr. and Amari Mims have, and how like tackles. I'm gonna butcher the quote here. Tackles are not found, that they're born, and I think that was indicative of like those guys are like rare body types, and you need to prioritize them. Whereas with guards, like they can be, they can maybe come in all shapes and sizes. So I'm not sure it's necessarily the athleticism. I do think that he would value arm length, which makes me positive about Kandra a little bit. But um, I think that in order to play for Scott Peters' offensive line, you have to be extremely intelligent, because he'll throw you a bunch of different techniques and methods to better your game. And scheme is obviously very much a part of that. And I think he's very scheme diverse. So being able to pick up on multiple concepts is also very indicative as well. So I think Kandra kind of fits the bill there. He definitely knows what he's doing. I don't think there's going to be a ton of work that Peters would need to do to kind of get his game up to speed, but the measurables still give me a little bit of pause. And if he does want someone who is kind of built in terms of more like the upper percentile of overall size and everything that comes with that, like that could be something, but we'll have to see what guys that they're looking for and who they're interviewing, and maybe that'll tell us a little bit about what they're looking for.
Yeah, I like what I'm seeing and what I'm hearing. To use an old adage, it looked like he was a guy on some of those film clips that kind of had the head on a swivel, looking for contact, looking for the next defender to take out, which is always a coveted thing. So local guy, they haven't grabbed a ton of them, but I mean they'll have as good of a scouting report as any on this kid. So I like what I'm seeing there. Could be really good value, like you said, early day 3 for the Bengals on that. And that's kind of, you'll see a run of interior offensive linemen usually around that spot anyway, because the tackles and that sort of thing usually go a little bit higher. But interesting player for sure. Let's drop the mic and get out of here, John. This show has flown by. I don't know how that really happened, but let's drop the mic and get on out of here. What do you got for us on our way out of the door?
I just wanted to just preface, I am a UC grad, I am a UC fan, but I am far from biased. I know that team is terrible right now, and I'm not happy with the direction of it. So for me to highlight a Bearcat is a sign that this guy I actually think is good, and not just there must always be a Bearcat. There must always be a Cincinnati kid on the Bengals. And if Sam Hubbard is not going to be here in 2025, if that is the case, I can think of no better replacement than Luke Kandra. So just getting that clarification out there. I'm not biased.
And I mean, it also points to, if it is I've done that with USC the past couple of years, not and some of the players, not great teams, but there are the handful of standouts, right? When there's a standout guy on a team that isn't great, you gotta highlight him for sure. I'm going to go a completely different direction, non-football. I just want to shout out a couple of my nieces, actually. McKenna and Corbin, they both go to kind of somewhat smaller, especially one they go to smaller private schools out here, and they both are soccer studettes, and their teams, unfortunately, were both eliminated in the state area championships recently. Well, not championships, but they made deep runs with their teams that didn't seem all that likely. Both played excellent soccer for their respective teams. Unfortunately, my niece Corbin's team was just eliminated last night, and my other niece McKenna was eliminated a handful of days ago. But great job by them, great job by their respective teams, and a lot of respect. I'm not a big soccer guy, but I find myself entertained watching, good soccer at any level. So kudos to both of them. They played great, and one is ending her soccer career. One is really kind of starting to get hers going, and she's got a couple of years left in my niece Corbin. So congratulations to both of them on good careers, good years, and to their teams for making deep runs.
Absolutely. I also was never fortunate enough to win at that high level, but it takes a lot just to get there. Not in soccer, I was in golf, but it takes a lot, especially in a sport as tough and as excruciating as soccer. So shout out to them.
I will say, dude, my niece McKenna played a game in a rainstorm, and we sat in the rain and watched her. And they kicked this team's ass, man. I mean, it was like 4-1 or something. And it was a team they were not expected to beat, and it was pouring. And they're played on turf. So that's why they kind of continue. There wasn't any lightning or anything, but I don't know, man. It's just like the toughness there of doing. I'm sitting there in the stands going, man, I got to get out of here. I'm cold. I'm wet, and I'm sitting here thinking, man, they're just out there for an hour and a half, just trudging through the rain, and it's dumping on all of them out there, and tough girls out there for sure. But kudos to both of them. That's going to do it for us. And this episode of the Orange and Black Insider, fun one. It flew by. Good stuff on Luke Kandra there, John. And we'll be back with more on this show, more free agent profiles, draft profiles, and of course, breaking news, free agency, draft, all that kind of good stuff. I believe we're going to try and get a representative out. I don't think I will be able to go personally. I tried to, but I don't think I'll be able to swing it out to the combine. But we'll have some, I believe, direct combine coverage. We'll double check on that, as well as maybe some draft coverage as well in person. We'll see how that all shakes out, but we'll be here or there regardless to cover it all. Again, get this show on the Believe in Cincy podcast channel with a slew of others. We're bringing you multiple different shows per week, so hopefully you still enjoy that during the off season. Go subscribe to that through your favorite audio streamer. Subscribe to the YouTube channel. As we mentioned before, click that show icon, do the subscribe thing, the bell, the thumbs up, all that good stuff. And again, our thanks to FOCO, the fans only company, for helping us bring this show to you all. Take care, everybody. And we'll be back soon with more Bengals talk on the Orange and Black Insider.